Well, good morning, Safe Harbor. Welcome back to our Sunday school class. We were off last week for Easter Sunday, but we are back in the book of Daniel today. Finishing up the book of Daniel today, and then the next 2 weeks we will do the minor prophets, and then we will do kind of an overview of the Old Testament in our final week, and kind of some applicational and theological points. And then we'll be done with our walk through the Old Testament, which has been a very good time. We haven't decided exactly what we're going to do after that, but we will make those decisions when needed. So as we get started here in the book of Daniel, remember where we are from 2 weeks ago. Daniel, we are starting into Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 1 is when they are taken away to Babylon. Daniel lives in Babylon for the rest of his life. He's taken when he's about 15 to 17 years old, somewhere around there. His three friends go with him, who we'll see in the story today, along with some other Jewish young intellectuals, and they are sent away into the Babylon kind of brainwashing system, if you will, in which they are taken to learn. They have their names changed to Babylonian names. They have to learn the Babylonian language, their philosophy, but they also have to learn their religion as well. And so they're trying to brainwash them basically into becoming Babylonians and stop worshiping the Jewish gods, so that they can then use them as ambassadors and administrators and all kinds of these kind of things. Then in chapter 2, we saw Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream sequence, in which Nebuchadnezzar has this dream about this big giant statue, and Daniel interprets the dream for him and tells him about all these different kingdoms. And we'll talk about that again today when we get to chapter 7. So chapter 3 picks up. Daniel is away in Babylon, and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are out in the province of Babylon. So that's why Daniel is not there. Chapter 2 ends with Daniel being in the city of Babylon, and they're in the province of Babylon. It'd be like if you're in Virginia, Daniel would work in Washington, D.C., and his three friends work in like Alexandria or something like that, kind of like the greater DC metro area, but not necessarily in the city itself. And so Nebuchadnezzar comes up with this idea, probably from his dream, that he's going to make this giant statue, golden idol, and he's going to make everyone bow down and worship it. Now, why would he do this? One, it's probably he's a little worried from Daniel's vision that his nation is not as powerful as he thought it was, and he's a little worried about these people who would maybe come after him. But two, also remember, they're conquering different nations. Babylon conquered the Assyrians, they conquered Judah, they conquered all these different nations, so they have all these different people within their empire who worship other gods. And so this is a way for them to kind of make people prove their allegiance to Babylon, and also a way to kind of get rid of some possible protests and different things like that, so that they can avoid any type of rebellion. Also, I think Nebuchadnezzar, as we'll see throughout the stories, is very vain and conceited, and so I think he also wants to make sure that they realize that he's in charge and that he is the great ruler of the ancient Near East. So he builds this golden statue, and then he brings in this band. All these terms are Greek terms, and so Sometimes the second, people who think Daniel was written in the 2nd century and not actually by Daniel the prophet will argue, well, there's all these Greek instruments that are listed, so that must mean Daniel was written during the time of the Greeks. Well, not necessarily. We know from archaeology that the Persians and the Babylonians and the Greeks, they all traded together, and they had mercenaries from different places and stuff, so it's very likely that they would have received some of these instruments from Greece itself. And so it's not as nearly as big of an issue as some of the critical scholars hold. So Nebuchadnezzar decides that whoever doesn't bow down and worship this idol will be thrown into the fiery furnace. What this probably was is probably in this picture here, there's these ancient brick kilns all across Babylon that they have found, and they were used to make bricks. You would heat the bricks and build everything in bricks. Remember, Babylon is out in the middle of the Middle East. There's not a lot of wood around, so everything is built with bricks for the most part. And so it's probably looks something like this. You see there's a hole on the bottom right here that is probably able to look through, which is how Nebuchadnezzar probably is able to look into it. And then there's an area on the top here where they would have tossed them into in the story. And so Nebuchadnezzar does this. They're out in the province of Babylon where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego work. They get all the people together. They said, okay, when the music starts, this Greek band starts, then everyone has to worship this statue. Music starts, everyone starts to worship the statue, and they notice there's these 3 Hebrew guys who aren't bowing down. And so they pull him away and take him up to Nebuchadnezzar. And at first, he's very, I think he likes the 3 guys. He knows they're friends of Daniel. So he likes Daniel a little bit at this point from being able to interpret the dream. So he gives them kind of a second chance. It says, they brought the men forward, and in verse 14, Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every other kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. So it's kind of like he's like, maybe they didn't understand, maybe they didn't get the instruction. He kind of gives them a second chance a little bit. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? So it's almost like Nebuchadnezzar, this is similar to what we've seen in the book of Isaiah with the Rabshakeh. Nebuchadnezzar sets up an apologetic argument against Yahweh in this chapter. And he says, your God is nothing. I've already defeated your God, essentially, by destroying Judah. Your God can't do anything. Your God can't save you. If I throw you in that pit, your God can't do anything. So you better worship me and my God. But look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response. They answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. So they're like, our God can do this. Yahweh can do this if he wants. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. So they say, look, our God can do this, but even if he doesn't, we're still not worshiping your God. We're still not giving in. And Nebuchadnezzar gets furious with this. He's an ancient Middle Eastern dictator. He's not used to people telling him no. He's like, how dare you not listen to what I have to say? How dare you talk back to me? Kind of this idea. And so he tells his men, make the oven 7 times hotter than it normally is. Now that's just kind of ridiculous. If you get tossed into an oven, no matter how hot it is, it's going to kill you. Making it 7 times hotter would have just burnt them faster. But he's angry, he's upset, he wants to make a show of this to make sure that nobody else does this. And so he tells them, make the oven hot. The oven is so hot that when the men take them up to throw them into the furnace, that the men who take them up actually die. It's so hot. It shows you just that this is really a miracle. This is not just some kind of accident. So they throw them into the furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar's looking through the side because the heat rises and you can get up closer on the side than up on the top. And all of a sudden he goes, did we throw 3 men in or is there 4? And they're like, we threw 3 guys in, sir. And he's like, well, I see another person in there, and he looks like, and the ESV says, a son of the gods. And that is actually what the text itself says. Now, the King James version, unfortunately, translates this, he looks like a son of God. And they capitalize it like it's Jesus. Now, it very well may have been Jesus, but the text itself says a son of the gods, plural, because one, Nebuchadnezzar is polytheistic. He believes in many gods. He doesn't believe in, and second, he wouldn't know that it was Jesus anyway, even if he saw him. So sometimes people then try to say, oh, well, some of these newer translations are trying to get Jesus out of the Bible. No, Jesus was never in this passage to begin with. That's an interpretation issue. It may have been Jesus, but the text doesn't clearly indicate that. So regardless, they survive, they come out. They don't even smell like smoke, which is another miracle in itself. If you've ever been around a bonfire or anything like that, you know you smell like it for maybe a couple days even. They don't even smell like it right afterward. And Nebuchadnezzar declares, oh, your God is greater than anything that we've ever seen to protect you in this fiery furnace. And so he promotes them, and they have a great happy ending, so to speak, from the story. Then in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar continues on, and you have this weird story in which Nebuchadnezzar is walking around Babylon at the beginning of chapter 4 and is kind of talking to himself and says, essentially, I'm so great, I'm like a god. I built this great city, I rule the world. And God is like, all right, enough's enough. You've tried to kill my guys, you've tried to do all this stuff. You are so self-absorbed that I can't deal with this anymore. And so God strikes him with this disease that makes him look like an animal. He eats grass, he does all this weird stuff. They call it lycanthropy. They have cases of this kind of thing where people go insane and they start acting like animals. And so they chain him up in the courtyard, and this lasts for like 7 years. So it's kind of like the king is crazy, but nobody wants to admit it because he's still the king. He's still in charge. So you don't want everyone to find out that he's crazy. But also remember, this is not, sometimes critics will say, oh, there's no way this could happen. There's no way that the guy could be the king and no one would know about it. Remember, they don't have press conferences. They don't have television. They don't have a State of the Union address. The average Babylonian never saw Nebuchadnezzar in their entire life. They wouldn't even know what he looked like, probably. They live all across the ancient world, ancient Middle East. Babylon controls literally thousands of miles. And so there's only a select group that would ever even have came in contact with Nebuchadnezzar. And so, I don't think that the critical argument, oh, there's no way people would have not realized this. Remember, there's only about a couple hundred people that would have needed to know about this. Everyone else would have just assumed, oh, the king is doing all right, the nation's running, everything's going smooth. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar, after 7 years pass, it says that Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up my eyes to heaven. This is 434. Lifted up my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. And so it seems like Nebuchadnezzar is converted at this point. It's like after 7 years, he realizes, I'm not God. There's another God who's stronger than me. And he's seen evidence from Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego who this is. And it seems like in the text, as best we can tell, that he converts to worshiping Yahweh. And he gets his sanity back. And then he eventually passes away. And his son takes over. And then his grandson takes over. And his grandson is not a very intelligent guy. We'll just say that. So in chapter 5, we see the fall of Babylon. Daniel's living this time. Now this is years and years later. So Nebuchadnezzar marries a lady named Amytis. They have a son-in-law named Nabonidus, who takes over when Nebuchadnezzar dies. Nabonidus marries somebody named Nitocris, who was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. So it's a son-in-law. And they have a son named Belshazzar. So he is his grandson. Now what's interesting is, for a long time, critical scholars argued there was an error in the book of Daniel because nobody heard of this guy named Belteshazzar that Daniel talks about. They found all the Babylonian king lists in with Nabonidus. And so they said, oh, this guy named Belteshazzar, nobody's ever heard of him. This is an error in the Bible. If you read stuff from the 1800s, early 1900s, they argue, the error in the Bible, Daniel thought there was another king, but we know it's not. Then they find this chronicle, pictured up here in the top, the Nabonidus Chronicle, in which Nabonidus, the king, says, I left and went to basically Saudi Arabia, out to this oasis in Saudi Arabia. He didn't want to be the king anymore, basically. He wanted to kind of go into retirement. And there possible that he had some health issues, and so he wanted to go to this kind of oasis that was known for healing properties, with some baths and that kind of stuff. And so he says, I left my son Belteshazzar in charge as the co-regent. And so, yes, he was the king of Belteshazzar, really existed. He was the king of Babylon during this time, the co-regent. And if you read the text, as we'll see, he says, I will put whoever can read the writing on the wall will become the third person in charge of the kingdom. Well, why does he say third? Because he was only the second person in charge of the kingdom. His dad was technically still number one. And so the answer was in the text the whole time, but people assumed, oh, there's an error in the Bible, it's wrong. But further archaeology has shown that the Bible was wrong the whole time. The Bible was right the whole time, and history had forgotten about this guy, and the critics were actually wrong. So Belteshazzar, he's encircled by the Cyrus the Great comes on the scene. He is the ruler of the Persian Median Empire. We talked about that in the statute in chapter 2, and we also talked about this in the book of Isaiah. He goes and starts conquering Babylon and actually surrounds the city. But Babylon is massive. It's the biggest city in the ancient world. It had 150 battle towers. It had walls like 40 feet high and 25 feet thick. So it was almost impossible to conquer. So Belteshazzar sitting in the palace going, yeah, the Persians are outside the walls, but they can't get in here. They're going to sit out there for years. They're never going to get in. Eventually, they can't break through our defenses. So he throws a big party. And he's having this big party, and all of a sudden there's some handwriting on the wall. It's this divine finger of God writing on this wall in Hebrew. The problem is nobody can understand it. They're like, what is this language? Remember, this is not like they just conquered Judah. This is in 539 BC. So they have conquered Judah like 60 years earlier. So they're like, what in the world is this? Nobody can read it. And so all of a sudden this woman comes in, this older lady comes in and reminds Belteshazzar, hey, why don't you go get Daniel? He could probably read it. Now there's some debate. Is this Nebuchadnezzar's wife Amitis, or is this Belteshazzar's mother? I think it probably is Nebuchadnezzar's wife, his grandmother, because Daniel's kind of in retirement at this point. So she remembers Daniel when everybody else has kind of forgotten him. He's kind of like retired. We know this because when he shows up, Belteshazzar says, are you Daniel? He doesn't even know him. He's been in retirement for some time at this point. He's like, at this point, he's like almost 70 years old, almost 80 years old. And so Daniel reads it and says it means Mene, Mene, Tekel, Perez, numbered, weighed, divided. Basically says your number's up. God has weighed you in the annals of history, and tonight's the night. Babylon's going down. And that's exactly what happened. Cyrus was a pretty smart guy. There was a river that went through Babylon, the Euphrates River. So he stocks it up and diverts it to a different upstream. The riverbed dries out, and his army goes through the riverbed under the wall and conquers the city basically without a battle. And they take over the Babylonian Empire. Belteshazzar is killed. Eventually they find Nabonidus and kill him as well. And the Persians then take over and start ruling. And Daniel's going to work for the Persians, because I think they have, Josephus, a Jewish historian about the time of Jesus, actually says that Daniel showed the Cyrus predictions that Isaiah wrote 150 years earlier to Cyrus. And so it could be Cyrus is thinking, hey, I like this guy. He's showing me that this guy did this, and he's a smart guy. He seems to be the only guy who knows what he's doing around here. And so he makes Daniel what they call a satrap, which is kind of like a really high-ranking official. This is a picture of what Cyrus probably looked like from one of the inscriptions on one of his walls in his palace. He conquered Media in 550, conquered Lydia in 546, and then conquered Babylon in 539. And then he ultimately dies in battle in 530, but his empire lives on. Talk about this guy called Darius the Mede. He is the king that Daniel's going to interact with a lot. He's the king of Babylon. That doesn't mean that he's Cyrus. Cyrus was the king of the entire empire, the Persian Media Empire. But this guy is kind of a local king that was in charge of just the city of Babylon that they leave in charge. We don't know who he is from history. Some people think he's this guy named Gubaru, who was the governor of Babylon. Maybe he had a different name. We know that they use different names based on who they were talking to at the time. Paul Tanner, who just wrote a commentary on Daniel that I'm reading right now, 800-page commentary on Daniel. He argues that this guy is actually the remaining king of the Medes, that they still had kind of their own king, even though Cyrus was in charge of everything, that this guy was actually still kind of the king of the Medes, and they give him Babylon as kind of a way to continue their alliance. Regardless, he's still the king, and it's not a historical issue. So Daniel's one of the three major guys that's in charge of Babylon at this time. And these other satraps and officials, they don't like Daniel. They're like, oh, he's Jewish, he's different, he doesn't have anything wrong with him, we can't bribe him, we can't get him to do anything wrong. And so they decide, we need to get rid of this guy. So they try to find some dirt on him, some political dirt to get rid of him, but there isn't any. And so they're like, the only thing that we can do is get rid of him because of his God. So they convince Darius to eliminate prayer for 30 days. They say, Darius, you just conquered this kingdom. There's all these people that worship other gods. We need you to eliminate prayer for 30 days to kind of get everyone focused on our gods. And he signs the agreement. Immediately they go and get Daniel, and he's still praying, and they bring Daniel ahead, and Darius actually really likes Daniel, but he can't change the law. There was a thing in the laws of the Medes and Persians that said once a king wrote a law, you couldn't go and change it. Even the king himself couldn't do it. He did that because when you have two separate countries formed into one government, they didn't want one king writing a bunch of laws, the next guy goes and changes them all, kind of back and forth. So once you made a law, it was unchangeable, and you couldn't make a new law that changed it either. And so once he does this, he's kind of stuck. And so he says, all right, Daniel, you're going to have to get thrown in the lion's den in a trial by ordeal, essentially. This is the idea that if you survived your trial, if you survived your punishment, it meant you were innocent, which is why when Daniel survives the lion's den, they don't try to kill him again. It's like, oh, God has shown that you are innocent. Therefore, we're not going to try and kill you again. So they throw Daniel in the lion's den. He survives. An angel comes and protects him. The king shows up early the next morning. And it's just kind of like, Daniel, are you there? He doesn't really think that he is, but he's holding out any type of hope. And Daniel's like, yeah, I'm here. Still good. Didn't die. And so the king gets upset at the guys. And because they were falsely accused him based on this trial of ordeal, he throws them in the lion's den, and the lions eat them. Showing that, no, it wasn't like the lions weren't hungry that night, and that's why Daniel survived. The lions immediately eat these other guys, and so it was truly a miracle that this happened. And Daniel becomes kind of the main advisor to Darius for until he finally passes away. Then the second half of the book that's kind of where the storyline of Daniel, the narrative story, his personal life ends. And the second half of the book deals with some prophetic visions that he has. And this is where the book gets very complicated and where people misunderstand some of the book as well. So the first vision he has is of 4 beasts. The lion represents Babylon, the bear represents Medo-Persia, the leopard represents Greece, and this monster with iron teeth represents Rome. It's similar to the vision that he had in chapter 2. So the head of gold and the lion are the same. The Media Persia, the bear, and the arms of silver, the belly of brass, and the leopard, and then the iron feet of iron is the Rome. And so you have this same kind of imagery in 7 that lines up with chapter 2 as well and gives some insight into this. The 3 ribs in the mouth of the bear, Persia, probably represents these 3 nations. These were 3 massive nations in the ancient world: Babylon, Lydia, which is up by Turkey, and Egypt. Persia takes out all 3 of the other major nations in the world. So it's probably why it talks about a bear with 3 ribs in the mouth. There's 4 heads on this leopard that represents Greece. What is all that about? Well, when Alexander the Great conquers the known world at the time, he dies when he's like 32 years old. He's very young when he dies, doesn't have an heir, and so his 4 generals split up the kingdom. Now this is almost 200 years after Daniel, and he's predicting that there's going to be these 4 heads. This is why critics want to date Daniel so much later, because they go, there's no way somebody could just guess all these specific predictions. They'd have to have divine revelation. Exactly. That's what we would say. As conservative evangelicals, we would say exactly. God told him this is what was going to happen. They talk about 10 horns, this kind of European empire. Then this little horn pops up, and we view him as the Antichrist in chapter 7. He's going to talk more about him as we go through. Then there's this picture called the Ancient of Days in chapter 7. God the Father, this is kind of God the Father who's sitting on the throne. And then this Son of Man figure shows up in verse 13. It says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Well, this has got to be Jesus. He's the only one that has a kingdom that never ends. And what's interesting is Jesus' favorite term of himself in the New Testament is the Son of Man. He constantly refers to himself as the Son of Man, tying back into this passage. He's not just saying, I'm a human. He's saying, I am this Son of Man figure that Daniel predicted 500 years ago. Chapter 8, he has this vision of a ram and a goat. The ram with 2 horns is Media Persia. The goat with 1 horn is Greece, led by Alexander the Great, and the goat defeats the ram in battle. And it's a prediction that Persia will fall to Greece, and that's exactly what happened. Alexander the Great comes in and destroys the Persian Empire and takes over very quickly. He conquers the known world in like 10 years, so fast, because he was such an amazing general. Then he has this vision of the 77s. This is probably one of the most confusing passages, but also one of the most interesting passages in all of the Old Testament. At the beginning of chapter 9, Daniel is reading the book of Jeremiah. And so we know Jeremiah lived, and Daniel apparently has access to this thing. And he says, he's kind of counting in his head mentally and going, Jeremiah said we'd have a 70-year captivity. It's been like 70 years. We're about to get out. And so he has this amazing prayer for revival in 9:3-19. It's like he's praying, God, please help us get out and help us to do better this time. It's just amazing prayer. One of the best prayers in all the Bible. I would encourage you to read it. But then he has this other vision. and it's a preview of the future. It's called the 70. Sometimes it's called 70 weeks, but it's not really 70 weeks. It's the term really is 77s. And it's showing that on the prophetic calendar, if you calculate this up and start at 445 BC, which is the time when Artaxerxes tells Nehemiah to rebuild, and you look at the Jewish calendar, which uses a lunar calendar and not the solar calendar like we do, and we can account for the leap years, it's showing you this is how long it's going to take for the Messiah to show up. And it says there will be 62 weeks or 434 years. And when you add this up, and then there'll be 7 more years, eventually you get to 483 years, which is almost exactly the time to the crucifixion. It's one of the rare times. There's not a lot of timing predictions in the Bible where it's a specific amount of time. Genesis 15, it talks about to Abraham, there'll be 400 years in captivity. There's a few of these, but not a lot. And so this calculates exactly to the time of Christ. The 69 weeks is 483 years, which would lead you right around to the crucifixion. So when Jesus kept telling people, you guys should know that I'm going to die. You guys should know. You guys should have been prepared about this. He's always telling the Jewish leaders, hey, you guys should have known that I was coming. People always go, well, how should they have known? I think one of it is this passage. He's saying, look, I told you how long this would take. And so, we can kind of look back on it in hindsight and go, oh, it's very obvious and it seems like it. But, Jesus obviously says that you guys should have been able to kind of figure this out and do this. So an amazing prediction. The 70th 7, then, it talks about the 16, after 69, the Messiah will be cut off. And there's this 1 week that's never described. And those that are pre-tribulational will say that this is the 70th 7 is the 7-year tribulation period in the future. The Messiah, it says that the Messiah will be cut off, crucified. And so, even in the Old Testament, we've already seen with the suffering servant, Daniel talks about the Messiah being cut off. So there's this idea that the Messiah is going to die several times in the Old Testament. Then you have the church age, which is undated. Nothing really about the church age in the Old Testament. Paul calls it a mystery, the mysterious church age, if you will. And then eventually you'll have the tribulation and then the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. There's just some views on eschatology. I'm not going to get into all that right now. But then the vision of the last days, he has these very specific predictions in the last 2 chapters of the book. Talks about the rise and fall of both Syria and Egypt in chapter 11. Very specific predictions about these guys who take over after Alexander the Great, all the way up to this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who takes over right before the Maccabean revolt in the mid-150s-ish. And he desecrates the Jewish temple. He sacrifices a pig on the temple and makes it unclean. And Daniel kind of predicts all these in advance, which is there's such great predictions in this passage that the critics are just like, there's no way anybody could have predicted all this. He has to be writing after the fact. And we would say, no, God allowed him to see the future as a prophet. And then finally in chapter 12, there's this great verse in chapter 12. Let me read it. There's not a lot in the Old Testament that deals with resurrection necessarily, but in chapter 12, Daniel is going to talk about this a little bit. So chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be written in the book." So this is talking about the end of days, basically. "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake." So the dead will come back to life. This is a resurrection, future resurrection. "Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So he says there's going to be a great resurrection someday in the future. It's going to be good for those that are good, but for those who aren't in the books, it's going to be end up bad. So this is kind of, John builds upon this when he's writing the book of Revelation and expands on this, and Paul and some of the New Testament. But we see this is starting to come into view even in Daniel in the Old Testament, that there's going to be a resurrection. Everyone's going to be resurrected. It's not just believers. Everyone's resurrected, but then it's the judgment. If you're saved, you go to heaven, you live in the millennial kingdom, you live in heaven forever. But if you're not saved, you're in trouble. You're going to live forever, but for eternal punishment. And Daniel sees this 500 years in the future, 500 years before the New Testament, I should say. But then look what he tells him. He says, but in chapter 4, in verse 4, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, How long shall it be till the end of these wonders?" He's like, okay, he tells Daniel, this isn't going to happen in your lifetime. Daniel, seal up the book. This is for the future. And so then he asks, well, how long is this going to happen? Is this going to take? "And I heard the man, and he raised up his right hand, his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, and half a time, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? And he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end." And so he concludes with basically, Daniel, you're not going to understand all this stuff. It's not going to happen in your lifetime. But in the future, this will make more sense. And John, in the book of Revelation, explains some of this in greater detail, and we kind of get a better view of this. But even now, we still don't know exactly what the future is going to look like. One day we will see that. We'll see how this all unfolds. We can kind of give our best guess, and we can look at it and look at these passages and do our best to understand it. But ultimately, we're not really going to know exactly how all this is going to look like until it happens in the future. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do our best to study it, to observe it, to understand it. And so the book of Daniel helps us in that way. Let's close in prayer. God, we thank you for this day. God, I thank you that as we see the book of Daniel and just the ability of you to predict the future, that we can trust that you know how the world's going to end. You know how this whole story is going to end. And we can trust that you have already given us a picture of what the future is going to look like, that you will reign on earth, that you will defeat Satan, defeat the Antichrist, that we don't have to worry about the future. We may not know exactly how it's going to look, but we have a good idea of what you are going to do, that you will ultimately win in the end, and that as long as we are with you, we will have success. We thank you and help us as we finish out the Old Testament over these next coming weeks. In Jesus' name, amen.